For freedom, Christ has set us free. That's how Paul starts this section of the letter to the Galatians. For freedom, Christ has set us free. And isn't it interesting that in this week, when we will celebrate our nation's freedom, we hear Paul say, for freedom, Christ has set us free. This week, when we'll hear many ideas of what freedom means for us and what freedom means for others, Paul says, for freedom, Christ has set us free. And many times in our lives, we have felt freedom. We have said, this is a place where I finally feel free, or perhaps we have lived in anticipation of that freedom. The first time we drove a car, the first time we moved out of our parents' houses, that first job that we had that finally let us have our own money. Or when our kids grew up and moved away and we had the freedom of an empty home again. Or when we retire and we have the freedom to do things we couldn't do before. We know what freedom feels like. We know what we want it to be, but all too often, when we think about far off freedom, we think about it as being able to do whatever we want, whenever we want. And when we think of freedom in this way, we always set ourselves up to lose. Because every single tiny thing that infringes on that freedom makes us feel like we've lost it all. All too often, we think only about what we are freed from our parents, or from not having enough money, or from our children's constant needs, or from our job. And we forget that when we are freed, we still have responsibilities. We are freed from things and for other things. It is not whatever you want, whenever you want. There's a lot more that goes into freedom. For freedom, Christ has set us free, says Paul. And it's particularly true of this kind of freedom, that it's not do whatever you want, whenever you want. The freedom to which Christ brings us is a freedom that carries heavy responsibilities. It is a freedom from the crushing powers of sin and death and evil and all of the powers of this world that go against God. But it is not a freedom to just do whatever we want, whenever we want. It is a freedom to turn in love to those around us, to pour out our gratitude to God for what God has done in our actions toward one another. For freedom, Christ has set us free, says Paul. So don't put on the yoke of slavery again. Don't go back to doing the very things that Christ has set you free from having to do. Because before we hear that we are free in Christ, we have just one question. What do I have to do to make God love me? What do I have to do to earn God's favor? But when we hear from Paul, from Christ himself, that we have been set free, the question changes entirely from what do I have to do to what am I going to do now that I don't have to do anything? How am I going to live my life now that I know I have been made free from the power of sin, from the crushing weight of death? What am I going to do with this newfound freedom? And Paul knows the danger of the freedom. Paul knows our tendency to turn back to the things that we used to do, the things that we're used to doing, the things that are comfortable. Paul knows our tendency to pick up the yoke of slavery again, slavery to sin, and live in the works of the flesh. Now, when Paul talks about flesh, he is not talking about our bodies. In other places, he talks about bodies, and bodies are not evil in any way. They are beautifully and wonderfully made by God. But our flesh is something else entirely. When Paul talks about the flesh, he is talking about that part of ourselves that draws us away from God. That part of ourselves that, when given freedom, would rather put the yoke of slavery to sin back on. That part of ourselves that tells us that it's all about us. To curve in on ourselves, as Luther calls it, and to turn away from God and from one another. Paul knows that we are drawn to these things. And Paul says, stop doing those things. For freedom, Christ has set us free. Why would you take those things back on? But they are tempting, and they are powerful. When we look at the list of things that Paul calls the works of flesh, we may feel personally called out. But what Paul is talking about is more a general way of being. That's why he ends the list with, and things like these. Because there are so many works of the flesh that he can't even pull them all together in one list. The works of the flesh are those things that cause us to focus only on ourselves, that draw us away from one another. The works of the flesh, if you look at the list, always lead to dissension and war and oppression and cruelty and anger and hatred toward one another. So Paul says, don't go back that way. For if the fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, goodness, and self-control, then the fruits of the flesh are the exact opposite. Instead of love, hatred. Instead of joy, grief. Instead of peace, war. Instead of patience, impatience, and the list goes on and on, till we get to that one at the end. Instead of self-control, self-absorption, self-obsession, curving in on ourselves and the rest of the world be damned. Paul says, don't take those things on again. For freedom, Christ has set you free. Martin Luther wrote a treatise called On the Freedom of a Christian. And I don't remember most of it, but I know how it starts. Martin Luther starts with two sentences that seem in fundamental opposition to each other. He says, the Christian is a perfectly free, Lord of all, subject to none. And then he says, the Christian is a perfectly dutiful servant, subject to all. This is the freedom we live in. This is the tension we live in as Christians. We are free. Christ has made us free. And we are called to live as slaves to one another, to care at least as much about our neighbor as ourselves. As Paul quotes, love your neighbor as yourself. We are called not to curve in on ourselves, but to open up and pour out our gratitude to God in our service to our neighbors, in whom we see the very face of God. For freedom, Christ has set you free, says Paul. So do not return to the works of the flesh, but walk in the way of the Spirit, starting with love all the way through that list. Walk in the ways of the Spirit, exhibit the fruit of the Spirit. For Christ came and died and rose again to bring us into new life, not to send us back to the old ways. We have been made free from the power of sin and death and evil and all the forces that work against God. So may we live lives of true freedom, not lives where we do whatever we want, whenever we want, but lives lived in service to God, lives lived in love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, goodness, and self-control. Now that we don't have to do anything to earn God's love, what are we going to do? Amen.